Good evening, and thank you very much both to the Museum of London and to the Fulbright Commission and to Gresham College for inviting me to give this talk. You have here two books. The History of the World, on the left, written by Sir Walter Raleigh, was published in 1614, here in London. Paradise Lost, written by John Milton, was published in 1667, also in London. Both publications were remarkable achievements that can tell us much about literature and politics in the 17th century, and possibly now. And I'm not talking about the content of the works, although I could do so. No, I am talking about their very publication. In my lecture this evening, I hope to explain that claim, and in doing so, I hope to show the ways in which writers, and in particular writers who had contentious political messages to convey, responded to and exploited what we would perhaps now call new media. And they did so in a particular place, here in the City of London, and at a particular time, the 17th century. A brief word about my approach to literature. At the heart of my research lies a desire to understand and to foreground the world in which writers operate. So when I read what Ben Jonson wrote about William Shakespeare, that he was not of an age but for all time, I say, yes, but Shakespeare worked within a particular culture of drama. He worked in a particular place not far from here, although the city authorities did not think much of the South Bank theatre culture on the other side of the river. Shakespeare worked within particular norms of performance and publication. A play would run for just a night or two, and play texts were generally ephemeral, shoddily produced things, often pirate editions half remembered by an actor looking for a bit of money. And he worked at a particular historical moment when the content of plays was controlled and policed by the state. And one sign of Shakespeare's success, of course, is that he was one of the few dramatists of the time who did not spend time in prison. So, although I agree with Jonson, who could not, Shakespeare is for all time. He is absolutely of his age as well. So, looking more deeply at what Jonson was trying to do, one realises Jonson is pursuing his own agenda when he wrote those lines. They come from a commendatory poem that Jonson wrote for the 1623 Folio edition of Shakespeare's plays. Now, in that edition, that complete works, Jonson sought to transform the status of stage plays through presenting them in a groundbreaking format, the Folio. The book on the left there is a folio. We are talking a large work. The folio usually reserved for weighty works of theology, law, possibly history, as if the tweets of Liz Hurley were to be published as an Oxford University Press monograph today. And more about that later, not Liz Hurley, but tweets. The folio reveals Jonson's agenda. He wants plays to be taken seriously. He even publishes his own plays with footnotes. Shakespeare himself didn't bother to publish his plays or to preserve his plays in print in any way. Now, the issues surrounding whether a work is written, published, read, are often at their most stark when one considers the lives and works of women. And following Virginia Woolf's lead, and she's a very persuasive arguer, I always wonder about Shakespeare's sister. Woolf imagines an equally talented sister for William. If you are denied education, or educated only to fulfill certain prescribed roles, if you cannot access pen and paper or a laptop, if you have no privacy or time for your own writing, if you are prohibited, whether by law or custom, from publishing your work, whether in print or over the internet, if you are barred from public or professional life, and if to publish or perform your own work would make you tantamount to a prostitute, and all of these were true for women in the time of which I speak, and remain true today for some women, then it is hardly surprising that no female Shakespeare or Milton appeared. But these questions, I think it's very important to remember, these questions are not only questions for women. And my concern this evening is to demonstrate the obstacles that both Raleigh and Milton had to overcome in order to write their most monumental works. And even more important, what was necessary to bring those works to the eyes of readers. In exploring this second issue, I will be talking about an emergent and rapidly changing print culture in 17th century London that has something in common with what has been described as our own digital revolution. So first to Sir Walter Raleigh. Why do I say that it was remarkable that in 1614 his History of the World was published? One answer is that the book's author, Raleigh, was, in legal terms at least, a dead man. His king, James I, controlled his lands, good and person, because in 1603 Raleigh had been condemned for treason. Although reprieved from execution by James, he was nevertheless imprisoned in the Tower of London, and he was certainly not pardoned. Now, I've written elsewhere about the early years of that imprisonment, both from the perspective of Raleigh and from that of his wife, Bess Throckmorton, and I will not discuss them here. Suffice to say, they can be characterised by the words desperate and hopeless, and a new low was reached in 1609 with the loss of Raleigh's Sherborne estate in Dorset. It had been held until then in trust by Lady Raleigh. But probably sometime around 1610, 1611, Raleigh seemed to gain a new focus. On one level, he had hopes from the court. King James's son, Prince Henry, was rumoured to be a supporter of his cause, and Raleigh wrote various position papers about naval or political matters, either for him or in the hope that he would be interested. These were tentatively circulated in manuscript. It's quite possible that Raleigh's interest in history was prompted by the desire to serve the young Prince Henry, but soon the project became all-consuming. He was absorbed in the writing of the history of the world, from the creation, you can feel the capital letters, to the present day, with maps. It's a very beautiful book, and there's a remarkable remain in the British Library. You can see Raleigh's notebook in which he jotted down and made sketches of maps in preparation for this book. So far, so scholarly, and therefore harmless, except it was a history. The ability of history to comment on the present under the guise of talking about the past was feared greatly by the state. Writers were already effectively banned from writing about contemporary matters unless under royal authority. But since 1599, the Privy Council had controlled the writing of histories as well. But as Raleigh's project grew, as his history grew, so did his ambition. He decided that he wanted to reach beyond the Tower walls, past even the court. He would publish. After all, he was already damned. I will ask how, and then why. How to get a work which was well over 1,000 pages of folio, and it still only gets up to the end of the Second Macedonian War, doesn't even reach the birth of Christ, how to get this monumental work printed and past the censors. Two answers first off, what we might call now networking, and second answer, anonymous publication. A key player is Ben Jonson. We've already seen how he was responsible for establishing Shakespeare's status with the Folio of 1623, that's a few years later. Jonson, it seems, Ben Jonson, got his publisher and his bookseller on board, one Walter Burr and William Stansby. By the way, the networking spreads everywhere. Having got the deal with Jonson's publisher and printer, Jonson was then hired to take Sir Walter's young and tearaway son on a tour of Northern Europe. It wasn't quite the grand tour, that hadn't quite got going by then. And Ben and Wat Raleigh, the young son, they went on a kind of extended alcohol-fueled trip around Northern Europe. We've got some mixture of a stag party, gap year, whatever. Neither of them covered themselves in glory. But anyway, that was a byproduct of this wonderful work, getting to the printers. The Stansby deal was done in 1611, and printing went on for 3 years. Raleigh continuing to produce material during that time. His commitment to the project only intensified with the death of Prince Henry, of young Prince Henry, in 1612, and thus the loss of his potential royal reader and supporter. It was now even more important to reach beyond the Tower walls. And by taking so long in the writing of it, he ended up writing the book back to front. The long preface, one of the most famous parts of the book, was completed only in 1614, just before publication. And this answers the second part of my how question. How did it get past the censors? It got past because they didn't see the whole thing. I'm not expecting you to read that, but it gives you a sense of the layout of the pages of the work. It got past the censors because they didn't see the whole thing. Now, if you picked up the work now and turned to Book 1, you would find chapters entitled "Of the Meaning of the Words Heaven and Earth", "Of the Intellectual Mind of Man, in which there is much of the image of God, and that this image is much deformed by sin", or possibly, a bit more exciting but not much, "Why it should be needful to entreat diligently at the place of paradise", which is not, as some commentators suggest, as high as the moon or under the equinoctial, but a nice, uncontroversial choice by Raleigh. It's in Mesopotamia. Now, this is undoubtedly what the censors saw and passed in 1611. And they added the stipulation, but it must appear anonymously. That explains how. But perhaps the more interesting question to me this evening is why? Print had been around for over 150 years at the time I'm talking about, but it was not as widely used as one would think. Yes, books of homilies were produced by the church or provided by the church to ensure that every parish church was on message every Sunday. We've got the Authorised Bible, of course, coming out at exactly this time. We're celebrating its quarter centenary this year. But this is state-sponsored publication designed not to create debate, but to establish conformity. In other arenas, print was far less important than what scholars now call scribal publication, passing things around in manuscript. Figures such as Sir Philip Sidney, John Donne, George Herbert never published their poetry. And as I say, they passed it around, they responded to each other. It was very much within a little coterie. Raleigh himself, as good a poet as many and better than most, never published a volume of poetry. These kinds of authors were reluctant to move into print for various reasons. In social terms, elite authors sought to seem above the mercenary world of trade. Added to that, certain forms of literature, such as lyric poetry and drama, were seen as fundamentally ephemeral, not for all time. Thinking in a more utilitarian way, there were also questions of readership. If you wanted to target the powerful elite, then it was often far better to use scribal publication. Why would you want to target anybody else? Why would you need to use any other method of communication? And finally, if you wanted to circumvent the licensing system, of course, manuscript circulation is the best way to do it. You can communicate controversial things that way in relative safety. All of these factors meant that a move into print for anyone in the period remained a relatively innovative step. But Raleigh had form in this area. He was the author of 2 works published in the 1590s, which illustrate very clearly, I think, 2 functions of print at this time. The first was an account of the only English naval loss in the war against Spain, the loss of Sir Richard Greville's ship, the Revenge. Raleigh, always good with words, was asked by his queen, Elizabeth, to turn a defeat into a victory, and he did so triumphantly. Raleigh tells the glorious story of one lone English captain's brave stand against a vast Spanish fleet. Yes, the ship had been lost, yes, the captain had been killed, but all the glory was England's and that of her queen. Greville's foolish, dangerous lone stand is transformed into an act of transcendent heroism. He goes on, his queen is ordained by God to bring Spanish Catholicism to its knees, to lead England to further Protestant greatness. Elizabeth, by the favour of God, will continue to resist, repel and confound all whosoever attempts against her sacred person or kingdom. In the meantime, let the Spaniard and traitor vaunt of their success, and we, her true and obedient vassals, guided by the shining light of her virtues, shall always love her and serve her and obey her to the end of our lives. It's great stuff. Its function is very, very clear. The Queen and her councillors had it printed, showing, of course, that the state was starting to use the new media for its own purposes. The other work from this decade is, this is purely for your entertainment, those of you like looking at old pieces of paper. The other work from this decade I want to talk about is the one on the left there. It's Raleigh's account of his voyage up the Orinoco in search of El Dorado. Now here, Blackadder, that well-known source of Elizabethan history, is harsh but fair. Raleigh did not find gold, or at least did not find mineable gold. On his return to England, Raleigh did what most people would have done. He wrote to his court backers, he asked for more money, explained what had gone wrong, and he sent them a manuscript account of the voyage, which still survives at Lambeth Palace Library, in the hope that it would persuade them. It did not. So, in an innovative step, he published the work, The Discovery of the Large, Rich and Beautiful Empire of Guiana, including an address to the reader, although still containing the addresses to Lords Cecil and Howard. This was followed up over the next 2 years by further print accounts written by Raleigh's team of the quest for gold, the aim being to drum up investors to keep the dream alive. So, back in the 1590s, Raleigh, unlike many of his contemporaries, had direct experience of producing print and understood its uses. In 1614, he turned to it again, but now with the gloss of a new ideology, which I will illustrate from the words of two allies of Raleigh's, the historian John Selden and the brother of the parliamentarian John Hoskins, also called John Hoskins. That was much more common in those days than you might think because of the high rates of infant mortality. You might name your first two sons by the same name. Selden, the historian, had his first work published by Stansby, Raleigh's publisher, Johnson's publisher, in 1614. In it, he explicitly justifies his move into print. He is writing about truth, which he calls a thing of public right. He self-consciously places himself and his project outside the patronage system, but within the realm of public duty. Hoskins published his first work, also with Stansby, in 1615, a collection of sermons given in 1614. He writes that he would not have published, but he has been forced into it by circumstance. His brother, the other John Hoskins, the parliamentarian, had been imprisoned in the Tower of London in 1614, and now they are making up as a family with the publication, and I quote, "For the time which I then lost from my function, whilst that which was sometimes preached in the ears of a few shall now preach to the eyes of all." So unable to fulfill his role as a preacher, because of his brother's imprisonment, he now publishes his sermons for the world. These quotations from contemporaries and allies of Raleigh reveal two things. The first is that most writers, particularly those from the elite classes, still believed, or said they believed, that publication was not their choice. They are forced into publication. The ideal remains manuscript or scribal publication. Print is dangerous. It smacks of trade, but is necessary in these times, with its growing rhetoric of public right of reaching the eyes of all. So one answer to the question as to why the history of the world was published is that it was a response to imprisonment and an attempt to find a wider audience, to bypass the court patronage system, to move beyond coterie manuscript culture to reach the eyes of all. The history of the world, to my mind, is therefore the act of a politician, a soldier, who denied an opportunity to participate in the active world because of his imprisonment, turns to reading histories and then to writing one based on his reading, in order, Raleigh argues, to contribute to the common weal. This is a history of the world offered to the world. It is a public political act on the part of the imprisoned Raleigh, and it is a plea to the reader, to the public, to understand him, that he is loyal. For conclusion, he writes, all the hope I have lies in this, that I have already found more ungentle and uncourteous readers of my love towards them and well deserving of them than ever I shall do again. For had it been otherwise, I should hardly have had this leisure, imprisonment, to have made myself a fool in print. Now, of course, he was being disingenuous. He may be making himself a fool in print, but over the 3 years of writing and printing, the text that emerged was anything but foolish. By the time of publication in 1614, not only was Raleigh's authorial presence visible to the reader if they knew where to look, despite the presence of his name on the title page, but more importantly, his own grievances and his trenchant criticisms of James I's policies imbue his supposedly historical text. For example, he takes a shot at the divine right of kings and suggests that kings may not be above the law. It's carefully done. It is true that there was never any commonweal or kingdom in the world wherein no man had cause to lament. Kings live in the world and not above it. More particularly, he takes a well-aimed shot at effeminate, corrupt, ineffectual kings, such as the Persian Darius and his licentious courtiers. And above all, although Raleigh, and this is early 17th century, he will never justify the overthrow of a monarch. He will never do that, but he will illustrate it again and again. He asks the question, why do kingdoms fall? His answer at first is that kings do not learn from history. This is in part the fault of the historians, who lay before the kings and princes of the world the actions, but not the ends, of those great ones which preceded them. In his final vision, justly famous, entirely cynical, yet passionately eloquent, Raleigh reminds his readers of the end of history, the end of time. And his closing concern is with the power not of God, but of death. Death puts into man all the wisdom of the world without speaking a word, which God, with all the words of his law, promises, or threats, doth not infuse. Death, which hateth and destroyeth man, is believed. God, which had made him and loves him, is always deferred. For Raleigh, history and death are both revelation. 4 years later, he would say, minutes before being executed, that he is grateful to come from the darkness of the Tower to the light of the old palace yard at Westminster. He was grateful because he was allowed to speak his message before death. The history written in the Tower, published, and I emphasise published in its broadest sense, his truth to the world. It revealed, and not just to kings and princes, Raleigh, the great statesman, at least in his own mind, his oppositional policy, and the fate in store for kings who err. Now, it's not surprising, given even the short extracts that you've heard, that the history was called in within weeks of its publication. There's another story to be told about that. In the short term, at least, the attempt to reach a wider public failed. But even as the history was being published, Raleigh was moving in another direction. In 1614, Raleigh was joined in the Tower of London by John Hoskins, the parliamentarian whose brother I mentioned earlier. Hoskins had been imprisoned for a speech in the Parliament of that year, and 2 others were imprisoned for providing the speech. At this time, Hoskins was developing his own ideas about, in his word, actuating the powers of the people, and Raleigh listened carefully, and he began writing again. If the history was Raleigh's most notorious attempt to speak to the people, then his dialogue between a justice of the peace and a councillor of state sadly not available in all good bookshops, was his most sustained attempt to write about the people as a political entity and to make claims, important claims, enduring claims, I think, for a public space in which opinions can be voiced in safety. I want to note just 3 brief things about this work. Number 1, a lesson. Putting political prisoners in the same prison is not a good idea. In 1614, Raleigh moves from a kind of generalised, partly religious-founded criticism of monarchy and a review of classical history in the history to a review of recent English parliamentary history and specific demands for the reform of the English political system. 2, Raleigh's dialogue, and don't be distracted by the work on the right, but I'll come to that in a moment. Raleigh's dialogue was circulated in manuscript, which exemplifies my point about an uneven move towards print. Manuscript circulation continued long after it should, logically, have been redundant. Now, the dialogue was circulated in manuscript for 2 rather glaringly obvious reasons. One, to go back to what I was saying earlier, it was designed to reach only elite policymakers, including the king himself. Indeed, 2 copies remain in the state papers, including a handily downsized version with the key points highlighted. All copies begin with Raleigh's address to the king, his sovereign misinformed. Secondly, there was not a chance in hell of Raleigh getting this politically charged history past the censors and into print. So another example of the use of manuscript circulation. But I want to make one more point about this work. The image you've got on the right here, you'll see here embedded is the title of the manuscript version, Dialogue between a Councillor of State and Justice of Peace. It was published in 1628, 10 years after Raleigh's death. So it did appear in print. It was unlicensed. There's nothing to say that this work is licensed anywhere here. And it was alleged to be printed in the Low Countries, in Middelburg. Often that imprint would be used to cover up the fact that it had actually been printed in a quiet corner of London. Most importantly, it had a new title, The Prerogative of Parliaments in England. Those of you who know your English parliamentary history will know 1628 as a year of crisis, the year Charles I decided that he would rule without Parliament, and it was this that pushed Raleigh's manuscript work into print, now harnessed explicitly to the parliamentary cause. Consider the title. It's no longer an ostensibly neutral dialogue, it was now a defence of parliamentary powers. And it would be published again and again through the 17th century, most notably in 1640, when King Charles reluctantly called a parliament and the country moved ever closer to civil war. And that does bring me to 1640 and John Milton, for whom that year was a year of transformation. Now, by that date, by 1640, John Milton had done very well for himself in many ways. The son of a scrivener father and a mother from a merchant family, he'd grown up very near here in Bread Street. Milton's powerful intelligence and his parents' ambition took him to St Paul's School, his local, what a local, and then to Cambridge University. In his 20s, he wrote beautiful poetry in many languages, a masque for an aristocratic patron, and he travelled for many months in Italy, where he had the most wonderful of times. Until his departure for Italy, he was, however, still living with his parents, now outside London, his father having retired. And an onlooker might have imagined that this not-so-young man was taking his time before heading towards the familiar career path of the church or the law. His family background, some wealth, more aspirations to gentility, and his talents suggested just that route. But neither priest nor lawyer, John Milton became a political activist. His only weapon, his pen. How did this happen? It was partly that, on his return from Italy, he finally moved back to the city and away from his parents. Lodgings in Aldersgate, literally a stone's throw from here. He was in a world familiar to him from his youth, of course, but everything was changed. In 1640, in London, there were new politics. Parliament was in action again. There were new conditions for writing. Censorship had been relaxed. And there were new uses for that writing. As Milton himself put it, as soon as freedom of speech, at the very least, became possible, all mouths were opened. His aims were magnificent. Now thoroughly aroused, he saw that men were following the true path to liberty and making the most direct progress towards the liberation of all human life from slavery. Milton was determined to play his part in that struggle for liberty. He put aside his poetry, whether in Latin, Greek, Italian, English, French, whatever, and transformed himself into a writer of polemical prose. His chosen format, was the pamphlet, quick to write, cheap to print, cheap to buy, a form constantly in dialogue with itself, as pamphleteer responded to pamphleteer. Is it too much to claim that in those heady early years of the 1640s, there was a kind of blogosphere of its time? Suddenly, print was all that mattered. Old manuscripts were picked up, dusted down, and published, including, as we have seen, Raleigh's dialogue. This revolution in the use of print was characterised by rapid turnover, as satirised in a rather glorious pamphlet of 1641, in which Suck Bottle the hawker, no stereotyping there of journalists, but who's trying to sell his pamphlets, is looking for a new book being out today, whilst the poet who sold a book the night before already has another to sell, but can't get a license for it. Authors, booksellers, printers, mercuries, hawkers, all thoroughly dependent on each other. When fortune later frowned, all five are fallen, all five do kiss the ground, went one jingle. Mercury became a common word for a newspaper, from the mercuries, or messengers, who brought news in person. But the term's other meaning, go-between, nimble-fingered thief, it says here, suggests vividly the edgy atmosphere surrounding news and other cheap print in this rapidly changing society. Now, I do not have time this evening to talk about the content of Milton's pamphlets. Suffice to say, he was radical on all fronts, whether personal life, arguing for the right of men to divorce their wives on the grounds of incompatibility, making him a truly lone voice in his own century, religion, arguing for the separation of state and church and almost complete liberty of conscience, education, arguing for something close to a modern liberal education, freedom of speech, his remarkable onslaught on pre-publication censorship, Areopagitica, pictured here, and of course, models of government. His tract in defence of the people's right to bring a king to trial and, if found guilty, to execute him, and in praise of republicanism, the work on the right here, the tenure of kings and magistrates, was written during the very trial of King Charles I in 1649 and got Milton a job in the Cromwellian regime that followed. He was appointed Latin Secretary to the Commonwealth and used his undoubted literary ability to sell, as it were, the new English Republic to a sceptical wider Europe. He was indeed now poacher turned gamekeeper. So Milton was doing what he said he wanted to do, using his pen in the service of his political and religious beliefs. In these years, the 1640s, the 1650s, his energies went almost entirely into prose, with the exception of a few sonnets, including a fascinatingly ambivalent poem about Cromwell. As you all know, it was not to last, either for Milton or for Cromwell. In 1660, Charles II was restored as King of England, and the Church of England restored as the state church. Milton, a Republican in politics and independent in religion, was not for turning. He was imprisoned and under sentence of death, only released, we think, on the intercession of well-placed and less politically stubborn friends or family. On his release in 1661, the future looked intensely bleak. Milton was 53. He had been widowed twice, had lost his only son, had 3 young daughters to care for, one of whom was disabled. He had lost his eyesight 10 years earlier and was now completely blind. He had, of course, lost the political position and the salary and the house in Petite France that had come with his support of Cromwell's regime. And his vision of Republican England, with each individual free to worship in his or her own way, with the leaders accountable to the people, was in tatters. Through the 1660s, the new government moved to enforce political and religious conformity. There would be no return to the frightening chaos of competing views that had characterised so much of the preceding decade of civil and religious government. That was the legitimate reason for it anyway, how it was legitimised. Compliance with the Church of England was enforced by an Act of Uniformity. More importantly, perhaps, a draconian licensing act controlled the press, all rather topical. No carpenter could construct a press. No ironmonger could found type without the permission of the Stationers' Company. Pre-publication censorship, the kind of censorship that Milton so opposed in Areopagitica, was reintroduced and involved a 2-tier process with government censors and the Stationers' Company both given more aggressive powers actively to search out seditious material and to imprison anyone with any connection to its production. Roger Lestrange, appointed in 1663 as Surveyor of the Press and one of the most outspoken and vindictive of the returning royalists, demanded and got tougher laws and powers to stamp out the publishing underground that grew up in response to the new measures. Dawn raids, rewards for authors, rewards for informers, imprisonment without trial characterised Lestrange's rule. The punishments for authors and printers could be severe. On 20th of February 1664, the printer John Twyn was executed for printing an anonymous book. The printer was executed. It was called the Treatise of the Execution of Justice and it echoed Milton's own Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, but instead of Milton's discussion of the legal basis for the bringing of tyrants to law and possibly to education, the offending treatise was a terrorist's appeal. The work urged the assassination of Charles II and his family. The suppression of opposition took less brutal, but perhaps more insidious forms. In London, the coffee house became the place to talk politics and to read news. Unable to stop the coffee house's opening, Charles II enlisted coffee merchants to act as spies for his state. And as ever, the repression was justified in part because of external threats, most notably the Dutch at this time, who were humiliating the English in naval warfare. Unity, conformity at home must be maintained. You can see why I say that for a Republican, nonconformist writer such as Milton, there was little hope. To make matters worse, a series of disasters would befall Milton's city of London. First, natural disaster, the plague, which Milton only escaped due to the friendship of the Quaker Thomas Ellwood, who arranged for the Miltons, John, his new wife Betty, and the 3 daughters to move to Chalfont St Giles in Buckinghamshire. More on Ellwood in a moment. In a moving letter from this time, Milton wrote, "Let me not be useless, whatever remains for me in this life." He would not be useless, and much did remain for him in his life. But many, including his correspondent, questioned whether he would ever write, let alone publish, anything again. If he was to do something, then the place to do it was here. It was in London. And Milton, with the plague receding, was back in London at the time of that letter, August 1666. But we all know what happened next, the Great Fire of London. For a man who loved the city, who needed the city, the plague and the fire were horrifyingly destructive of a familiar world. destroyed Milton's London. Didn't actually destroy his home. By this stage, he was living north of this map here in Bunhill Fields, another nonconformist area, of course. The fire had implications for any aspirations he might have had as an author, had a catastrophic effect on the book trade. In a tragic misjudgment, the booksellers and printers of the area around St Paul's stored their stock in the cathedral, charged for the pleasure by the Bishop of London, and approximately £200,000 worth of books and papers were lost in the fire, and many in the book trade never recovered. Let me not be useless. How, under these circumstances, could Milton make his voice heard? The answer lies in the networks in this city. On his release from prison in 1661, Milton lived first in Jewin Street, a centre of nonconformist culture, packed with French Huguenot refugees, and it was there he started tutoring again to earn some money. Thomas Ellwood, the Quaker who got him away from the plague, and to a Quaker stronghold in the Chilterns, of course, was one of his students. And as a Quaker, Ellwood had had first-hand experience of the kind of persecution and imprisonment for his beliefs that was common at the time. But he also had knowledge of the oppositional networks that enabled those beliefs to survive. Unlicensed print was, in the words of one historian, the Quaker network's lifeblood. Quakers did not recognise, this is a fundamental ideology, did not recognise the state's right to silence the printed any more than the spoken word. Our mouths were not opened by, nor can they be shut by the will of man, wrote man one. Now, Ellwood took lodgings near to Milton, and he wrote later, "From thenceforth went every day in the afternoon, except on the first days," that's the Quaker term for Sundays, "of the week, and sitting by him in his dining room, read to him in such books in the Latin tongue as he was pleased to hear me read. It seems a pleasant image of scholarly retirement, but books were not there merely to be enjoyed. They were not merely dead things, but alive, as Milton famously argued in Areopagitica. Better kill a good man than destroy a book." Books were there, were alive, and were to be used. Like all readers in their century, Thomas and John were reading for action. Indeed, John Milton was not only reading, he was writing, and he had now completed a major new work. A striking act of loyalty made the next step possible. One Samuel Simmons agreed to publish John Milton's new work. Now, Simmons was very much part of the city print world. The son of printers and booksellers, he'd actually grown up a neighbour of Milton's in Aldersgate Street in the 1640s and 50s. Milton's new work was, however, a bold step for Samuel Simmons. It was the first work he was to register under his own name. So the printer's name was going to go on the work. And in doing so, it showed a remarkable loyalty on the part of the printer-publisher. Matthew Simmons, Samuel's father, had printed Milton's work in the far-off days of the 1640s, including his most radical and now, of course, condemned and burned, blacklisted works, such as The Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce, Iconoclastes, and The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. If you look at Areopagitica, just a small detail, it protects its publisher, its printer. Milton is willing to risk his name in the 1640s. He doesn't risk his printer and publisher. So he was loyal to the Simmonses as well. I should say that it's not proven that the Simmonses did publish Areopagitica, but it's pretty certain that they did. But the Simmons family had not published anything by Milton, for good reason, for 26 years. But on 27th of April, 1667, the contract for Milton's new work was signed, and as you will have guessed, its title was Paradise Lost. But next came the really difficult task, getting the work past the censors. Remember, pre-publication censorship. Milton's regicide tracts were still very much in the public mind, and the very title, Paradise Lost, could quite easily be seen to refer to the political paradise that the Republic might have been. Milton had to tread very carefully. Any explicit criticism of the Stuart monarchy, any impassioned plea for republicanism, and the work would never reach the booksellers. In the light of all this, it is somewhat surprising that Paradise Lost did get past the censor, and scholars have shown in some detail that it was beautifully timed. There was a lot of thought going into the precise moment to get it out there. Wise decisions were also made about its presentation. If I can go back to my opening, it's a very small book, and it's a very plain book. It looks simple, it looks unthreatening. There are no addresses to the reader, there are no endorsements from celebrity Republicans, there are no images of the author. And also, something that still in a way weighs down the book, it is easy to view Paradise Lost as high culture. Its elevated style, meaning that it can't really have anything to do with the messy business of politics, let alone non-elite politics, the wide readership that the censor had a duty to protect. So it is rather remarkable that this first small quarto edition of Paradise Lost appeared in October 1667. That John Milton emerged alive from the regime change of 1660 is noteworthy. As one opponent said bluntly, he was Latin secretary to Cromwell and deserved hanging. That he entered into the most creative phase of his life is surprising. That he found a way to make his voice heard in the new conditions, it is nothing less than extraordinary. It is up to you, of course, to decide what, if any, message Paradise Lost carries, political, religious, moral. For those of you who have not read the work, I recommend reading it out loud with a glass of something in one hand and the poem in the other. For those of you who are forced to study it at school, bowing under the weight of its scholarly footnotes, I recommend the same thing. Remember, it was first published just as a poem. Even better, get together with other people and read it out loud. I was lucky enough to participate in an all-day reading of the poem at Sutton Courtenay. Philip Pullman was Satan, and I was Eve. And needless to say, Pullman had all the best lines. The history of the world, on the left there, despite its maps, is harder to recommend to a modern readership, but I'm still going to. Some parts of it contain passages of prose that are as good as anything I've read. And if you have a taste for Macedonian history, enjoy eloquent explorations of the meaningless of human endeavour, or are fascinated by Hannibal, as Raleigh is, then you will find much to enjoy. And as I say, the maps are beautiful. But, as I said right at the beginning, I am not concerned, at least this evening, with the content of these works, but in what their publication shows us about Raleigh's and Milton's use of new media, in their case print, for political purposes. And I hope I've shown, to some extent, the battle for the control of that new media. My case studies, I hope, demonstrate not only that old media coexists with the new, but that old battles are constantly being refought, but in different ways, as they are today. When I was invited to give this lecture, many months ago in fact, events in Egypt were already being labelled the Twitter revolution. My sense, and I am no expert, was that this was to overplay the power of social networking tools, and indeed the new media. Subsequent events in Libya and Syria, and dare say in Egypt as well, to name but two civil conflicts, have shown starkly the limits of social media, whether as a mode of free speech or as a tool for political activists. In the end, tanks and guns continue to decide the fate of civilians rather than tweets. More recently, and much closer to home, very close to home for some of us. The role of new media in the July riots in the UK drew much attention. There was, unsurprisingly, talk from the government about banning people from social networks or shutting down their websites in times of civil unrest. It seems that BlackBerry can do it for themselves, but they don't need governments. But anyway, which moderated somewhat into discussions about the measures that companies could take to help contain future disorder, including how law enforcement agencies can use such sites more effectively. Symptomatic of this dynamic was a research call from the government's counter-terrorism unit for the development, and I quote, technology-enabled solutions for the gathering and analysing publicly available data to gain an understanding of current and developing events. I'll leave you to translate what that means. Twitter, to give one example, is valued for good or evil, in part because it bypasses or challenges the established media and the state's control of information. Its very ability to do so, however, means that it is now, of course, being absorbed, used, monitored by the established media and the state. And for this reason, because of this interplay, this dynamic, I would argue it is vitally important that we analyse the evidence we have. Both Raleigh and Milton, they may have been writing hundreds of years ago, are eloquent that records must be kept and records must be available, and that access to information in order to judge historical events is vital to a free society. It's important to analyse the evidence we have, if only to counter repressive measures such as those mooted in the aftermath of the July riots. The Guardian did some excellent work on this, published on the 24th of August 2011, I believe still on its website. They analysed more than 2.5 million Twitter messages relating to the riots in England and demonstrated that Twitter was mainly used to react to riots and looting rather than to incite events. In fact, 8% of the total 206,000 tweets were involved with the clean-up operation. Moreover, as in the 17th century, new media coexists with the old. Those are post-its. Some of you may have seen them. Whilst the new media seemed to, in the words of one Dr. Martin Farr, quoted in an article in the BBC, the new media characterised or facilitated the rioting. See, he's taking the idea that it facilitated the rioting. Other, much more traditional forms of communication emerged in the aftermath, collections of post-it notes expressing support for the community. In the words of Dr. Farr again, writing notes is very old media. It's as if it's a restatement of community identity. It may be even perhaps a response conscious of its own form, low-tech, fighting back against smartphones. But I would add, look at the way this is already being channeled by larger organisations in the second image there. Lionel Barber, the editor of the Financial Times, made some similar points, but perhaps from a different perspective, last month at the Fulbright Eccles Centre lecture at the British Library. He argued that old and new media would continue to coexist. In the same way that television did not destroy radio, online news will not destroy the newspaper. Nevertheless, as he pointed out, thanks to social media such as Facebook and Twitter, a far wider range of people take part in gathering, filtering and distributing news. The death of Osama bin Laden, for example, first appeared in the Twitter sphere, according to Barber. This, of course, has links to the print revolution I've been talking about of the early 1640s, enabled by the relaxation of censorship. Consumers of print became producers of print. Turnover increased rapidly, print becomes cheaper, more expendable, the content becomes more challenging. And then comes the reaction from whatever or whoever is threatened by this expansion. A very brief digression before I make my closing comments. Penguin have published Twitterature. It is quite entertaining. Satire aside, does anyone here believe that Twitter or any other form of social media will generate its own literary form. And I could have given an entire lecture about the rise of the novel meaning new, coming from the dissemination of news in the generation of Milton's final years and immediately afterwards. But that really is another story. To return to Raleigh and Milton, I acknowledge that I have been offering a liberal, hopeful analysis of their literary legacy. Both writers were, to a greater and lesser extent, pushed by crisis into print, but they found ways to make their new media work for them and to negotiate the controls in place to stop them doing just that. Their responses represent profoundly creative forms of political engagement, and in Milton's case, one of the great works of literature, full stop. But I want to end with two sobering reminders of the realities of life and indeed death in 17th century England. I want to mention a strange little poem from 1642, which offers a glimpse of Milton's response to the threat that the Royalists would retake the City of London, a parliamentary stronghold. The poem is a sonnet in English addressed to a captain or colonel or knight in arms, and subtitled, When the Assault Was Intended to the City. It is a plea from Milton to whichever member of the military might come to get him, whether captain, colonel, or knight. The message is simple, but the poem typically is not. Take my house, but please save me, because I can be your chronicler. All regimes need their writers. Somebody, not Milton, added a note to the manuscript copy to say that the sonnet was pinned on his door. Whether or not the poem was indeed pinned to the door of Milton's house in Aldersgate, it is a vivid reminder of the fear engendered by civil war, and perhaps of the naivety of those who think that words matter more than muskets. The sonnet was not put to the test. The assault never materialised. Another little poem shows us something similar with Raleigh, how he uses words at a time of crisis. Back in Raleigh's heyday, in the court of Elizabeth I, he wrote a glorious, mildly erotic carpe diem poem, a poem of seduction, reminding his woman that time was passing and the bedroom is this way. Somewhat surprisingly, but the man is full of surprises, the night before his execution in 1618, Raleigh returned to the poem in his cell in the Tower of London. He took the poem's final verse and transformed it, just by adding 2 lines, into a remarkable farewell to the world. And he wrote the verse, which is why we have it, into the only book he was allowed at the time, the Bible, of course. And here it is. Even such is time, which takes in trust our youth, our joys, and all we have, and pays us but with age and dust, who, in the dark and silent grave, when we have wandered all our ways, shuts up the story of our days, and from which earth and grave and dust the Lord shall raise me up, I trust. This little poem became a crucial part of Raleigh's legacy, attached to his political works, convincing succeeding generations of his faith. There'd always been a question mark about his beliefs when he lived. It convinced them of his courage, of his integrity. But it is also, I think, a fitting place to end my lecture. Raleigh expresses a tentative and inspiring hope that the story of our days will not be shut up forever, that the silence of the grave can and will be overcome, that words can prevail. Thank you.